The whole region is on the cusp of shift from on various perspectives, geopolitical, but also from business human rights perspective.
We are looking at smallholder farmers, especially at risk because of climate change, because of environmental degradation.
Social risks are structural. They're not an isolated case.
In 2018, I used to live in Jordan. I still remember driving from Amman down to the Red Sea. For hours, there was nothing but desert, flat, empty, endless. Then out of nowhere, these huge industrial buildings appeared. At night, they were covered in thousands of tiny lights. It was like a city dropped into the middle of nowhere. In the daytime, you'd see the white smoke pouring out. I only found out later they were fertilizer plants, part of an industry that quietly produces on a global scale. That moment stuck with me because it shows how the Middle East isn't just about oil and gas. The region is tied into almost every global supply chain. Hazelnuts from Turkey end up in your Nutella. A t-shirt you buy in Europe might have been made in Jordan. But it raises the question, how responsible are these industries? And what does due diligence really mean in a region this complex? A region that also, for some time now, has been experiencing political instability and is home to millions of refugees and migrant workers. In today's episode, I talked with Krystel Basel, a lawyer and a founder of Business and Human Rights Middle East and North Africa organization. We will dig into the risks companies need to look out for and which communities are too often left out of the conversation about responsible business conduct in the Middle East. Hi, Krystel. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Hey, Alexandra, thank you so much for inviting us to be part of this podcast.
The pleasure is all ours. Well, Krystel, tell us what's your story and how did you end up opening Business and Human Rights MENA organization?
So I'm an expert in business and human rights, and particularly in the MENA region. I come from a background of law, so I used to be a lawyer, particularly in international arbitration, before then converting and becoming an expert in business and human rights. After years of working in this space, I realized that there was not enough talk and enough work and content that this was being done for the MENA region and by the MENA region, which is why back in March of this year, we launched BHR MENA, which is an organization that is solely focused on business and human rights, the only one to date in the region that is solely focused on business and human rights across the Arab states.
Indeed. And I still remember your post on LinkedIn that was about business and human rights. I believe it was about workers in Qatar. And it was in Arabic. And it really struck me that time because there is a lot of discussion globally about responsible business conduct in the Middle East. But I personally have not come across much of this type of content in Arabic. And I thought that was quite outstanding. So, Krystel, I'm really happy that you were able to join us today. So tell me, you work with companies all over the region, and it's quite a complex and diverse region. So if you are a sustainability professional sitting in one of these companies, what would you say are the 3 things that any of them needs to keep in mind if they are working in the Middle East?
That's a very good question. So first of all, I would say we need to start recognizing in the MENA region, there's a lot of talk on sustainability, a lot of talk about on ESG, but there's still this sort of lack of capacity and lack of knowledge around what do we mean by social impact and what does it mean risk to people. We see, for example, that the CSR and philanthropy is very, very advanced in the region. And people and companies do a lot of community work, etc. However, there is lack of understanding when it comes to the risk to people from a rights respecting perspective. So what I would say is that social risks are structural. They're not an isolated case. Ignoring the risk to people is not just a human rights issue. It's also a direct business risks. It can get the company into delays in projects, reputational damage.
Just to put that in practice, so let's imagine 2 scenarios. In one, I am a company based in the EU, and I am sourcing cotton from Egypt.
Okay.
What would you think that I need to particularly take into consideration when doing that due diligence and knowing that my materials are coming from Egypt?
Of course. So first and foremost, I would say climate change. Climate change in the MENA region is not an understatement when it comes to social risks. Extreme heat, water scarcity, and these impacts are definitely going to impact smallholders and cotton farmers in the first place. So just from a supplier and supply chain resilience perspective, this is number one to consider. Number two, it's the impact of climate change on the smallholders and farmers themselves. When it comes to their health and safety, we already see reports coming out on the impact of heat on workers, from dehydration to heat stroke to kidney damage, because as a result of all of that. So this is first, I would say, climate change. Second, what we noticed also in practice is that even if these multinational companies are still highly reliant on social audits. And unfortunately, we also have cases demonstrating that these social audits are falling short from identifying the risk to people. And this is primarily due to the fact that the suppliers on the ground lack capacity to either properly respond to these audits, or the audits themselves are not well tailored to the local realities on the ground.
So let's look at the second scenario. We see a lot of renewable energy projects now taking place all over the Gulf countries. And so let's say that I am a company that is building a solar panel plant in Saudi Arabia. So what are the three things that I should be aware of when it comes to my supply chain, the risks, the human rights impacts that I may be causing?
Of course. So while all of these projects are very welcome in the diversification of these countries from an economic and a climate standpoint, there is, I would say, primarily three human rights risks that can occur. So first, like where we were speaking earlier, the impact on migrant workers and the workers on site in the phase of construction and maintenance of these plants, especially when it comes to the harsh climate and extreme heat scenario. Second, we would have to look at also where the material is sourced. So whether in the supply chain, the solar panels or the materials being used in the plant were sourced from a right-respecting manner in countries where we have reports of forced labor, for example, China or Vietnam and other countries in the supply chain.
You mentioned unforced labor, and I think in your responses, what I hear is that there are several populations that are more at risk in the Middle East. And so we are looking at smallholder farmers, especially at risk because of climate change, because of environmental degradation. So, of course, risk to their livelihoods. You mentioned workers, particularly the ones who may be exposed to heat stress. So I imagine the ones that are working outside. So we are speaking here construction sector, we are speaking about agriculture. And then you also mentioned migrant workers who are also very prevalent in a lot of projects in the Middle East. So my question is, when you look at supply chains in the region, which groups are most at risks, and where do you think companies often overlook problems?
Absolutely. So as you just mentioned, migrant workers, low-wage workers in labor-intensive sectors are the most at risk. But when we need to also look at is not just the construction sector and the mega projects, agriculture. We also need to look at the impact on migrant workers and also women when it comes to, for example, cleaning, hospitality, manufacturing. And here we see more the impact on women in that comprise a significant portion of the workforce in such sectors, or also manufacturing of garments, for example. We see more of an impact on women. But also a category which is, I guess, cross-cutting is temporary workers and subcontracted workers. And we see and informal workers, and we see this across all sectors, really. So, for example, sometimes you have management, logistics, delivery services, which are very prevalent also in the MENA region, and in other sectors, also in the garment sector, we see the high reliance on informal and temporary workers. We see this also in particular in countries where there is high, not just migrant workers, but there is high rates of refugees. So, for example, in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, we see that there's high reliance on refugees, either coming from Palestine or Syria and working in the region. And here there's often high rates of violations taking place because companies generally take advantage of their vulnerability and their labor is not compensated adequately.
MENA is it's a huge region. Which populations are more at risk depending on which country?
Yeah, so for example, if we are in the context of the GCC, migrant workers is definitely top of the list. We have countries like Qatar where 90% of the workforce is comprised of migrant workers. But it's important to note that within this category, we have different layers and different groups of migrant workers. So you have the low-skilled workers, and these are generally the most vulnerable. Then you have the skilled workers, and those can be, for example, in the cleaning industry, in hospitality, and the services in general. And then we have the high scaled, because this is also a misconception in general to note that, for example, generally people think that for example, the Kafala system only applies to migrant workers, where in fact it applies to everybody with a work permit in the region. So it could be a high skilled engineer working in an air conditioned office that has also, for example, in Kuwait, he also needs to sign and take an exit permit from his employee before he leaves the country. So there's a little bit these misconceptions about how the law applies, the Kafala system law applies, but it's important to note that definitely it has more adverse impacts and harm on the most vulnerable, which is generally the migrant workers in the context of the GCC. Now, when we go to areas where there's conflict or refugees, as we were speaking, if there is no presence of migrant workers, which is generally they are seen to be the most vulnerable and the least paid, then in that sense, refugees come as the group that is most impacted.
Mm-hmm. Do you see any of the sectors that are now operating in the Middle East actually moving the needle on human rights? So actually trying to put better protection when it comes to human rights of the stakeholders they operate with?
100%. We are currently seeing a real shift. I mean, the whole region is on the cusp of shift from on various perspectives, geopolitical, but also from business human rights perspective. So most countries, I mean, we know that Qatar reformed its laws already and has repealed the kafala system, and other countries are following in this in these steps, in the sense where they are already amending. We know Saudi Arabia last year starting to amend its kafala system as well, and other countries are doing the same. However, what we see in practice, namely if we take Qatar as an example, is even though the law was repealed, in practice we still have a long way to go. So there's still a lot of reports of unpaid wages, for example, late payment of wages, and informal work that is still happening, grievance mechanisms that are not also working optimally. So there's still a lot of work to be done on the ground. And this again comes back to the need for general capacity building when it comes to these issues, for businesses to really take into account and understand strategically why it's important to integrate all of this in their business models and in their understanding of how they need to operate on the ground.
And just for those who maybe were not aware before with the kafala system, so can you quickly explain to us what it was and why is it so significant that a lot of countries have abolished that, and what kind of does it mean for supply chain risks? So if before I was looking at supply chain in Qatar, let's say, and I know that workers were hired on the kafala system and now the country repelled it, how does it change the risks I'm going to see in my supply chain?
So the kafala system is a set of laws and policies that delegate the responsibility for example, acquiring a visa and being able to work to the employer. So, for example, it gives control to the employer in the sense where they're able to allow entry, residence, work, and in some cases even exiting the country in the hands of the employer. In other countries, once you have a work visa, you can enter and exit the country as you see fit, and you don't have a restricted freedom of movement. What the kafala system does is that it gives the employer this power of controlling the employees in their contract and how they can move, really.
Is there any other legislation that is kind of shaping what is currently happening in the Middle East? And what is the difference between the Gulf states, between the Levant and North Africa as well?
The legal landscape is shifting fast. As we mentioned, the Gulf states are moving towards amending their kafala system laws. For example, including something they're calling a wage protection system, which is to digitize how employers are paying the migrant workers through digital systems. This way, it's easily tracked. There is, for example, legislation around summer midday work bans, and we saw this across all of the countries over summer. However, it's important to note that while it was a very good step, however, critics on the ground are saying it's not enough. It's not enough to have a work day ban from, generally it's between 12 and 3 p.m. But we note that in the GCC countries and during summer, even as early as 10 a.m., the temperature can get to around 45, sometimes 50 degrees Celsius. So even outside these work ban legislation, there's still a lot of work to be done around that. So it's very promising in the sense where we're seeing that reform is happening. We also see that the Gulf states are also moving quicker with their ambition when it comes to their Vision 2030. But I mean, we also see some dialogue taking place with UN working groups and UNDP, for instance, on business and human rights in countries like Oman, like Libya, even Palestine recently. Morocco has held a session this year on public procurement and business and human rights. So there is this general shift, and it's happening as we speak in the Middle East. It's still work in progress, and unfortunately, we see that the countries that are mostly hit by conflict, so Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, and Palestine, are still lagging, even though we know that from experience that the worst human rights violations are taking place in conflict-affected areas.
Definitely. Just listening to this and recognizing how diverse and how complex the situation in the Middle East is. We have countries that are in the state of conflict. We have countries where, let's say, legislation affecting labor rights is changing. It's changing slowly, but it is changing. We have countries that maybe are not yet working on their legislation, yet there are some other initiatives happening at the policy level when it comes to this discussion about business and human rights. But so if I'm sitting in my company and again looking at prioritizing what is it that I should budget for, that I should look at, when I'm looking at supply chain risks, when I'm looking at sustainability, what do you think is one kind of key takeaway that you can share with those corporates trying to prioritize and dealing with a range of issues affecting global supply chains?
I would say one thing, and I think it's at the heart of it now, is capacity building and training. I think is the most important thing we can do now in the Middle East, because of this general lack of understanding and knowledge about the risk to people. What is the risk to people, and how as a business I need to identify it. So we're really at early stages. So before getting into conducting human rights due diligence, integrating human rights due diligence and conducting human rights impact assessments on the ground, which are obviously very needed in order to identify all of these risks. It's important for the companies to understand why they're doing this before, so that in order for us to have strategies that will stick, things that will make sense to the company, and it's not just tick box and compliance and just a good comms statement that they would make further down the line. It's really, if we need to make sure that things are really well integrated, the companies at this stage need to understand why they're doing this. I'm especially referring to the local Middle East companies and not the international multinationals, which are more mature in their human rights journey, and they probably already know why they're conducting human rights due diligence in their operations. And what I would say to multinationals in that sense is not to approach it from a tick box exercise and really start to look at people risk in the Middle East, because of also the lack of regulatory and mandatory human rights due diligence in the region, because they don't have to. We generally see that businesses are looking at it from a very, compliance approach, highly reliant on social audits just to tick the box and say that they've checked. However, it's far from meeting and mitigating the harm and the risks that are impacting the most vulnerable.
And I think that you really nailed it. I think that this is exactly where the work needs to start, from raising awareness, because you can't really address something or change something that you don't understand. At the same time, what's really interesting is to keep assessing the risks to people, because as we are learning, people are facing certain challenges that are obviously affecting their lives, whether these are excessive recruitment fees being paid by migrant workers, whether these are impacts of climate that are being experienced by farmers, where maybe they are seeing more droughts, or whether they are workers working outside in the construction site and essentially working in 40 degrees heat. This is very tangible impact on their lives. And I do believe that as the capacity building programs continue, there is also a need to make sure that companies are addressing some of the issues that are felt by people. So thank you for sharing all of your knowledge.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alexandra.